Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and cut through the noise to find the most illuminating insights. Today, we're diving into the comprehensive life of an American icon, Rosa Parks.
And it's a story that, for too long, has been trapped in this one singular moment. The quiet seamstress who was simply too tired to stand up on a bus in 1955.
Right, that's the textbook summary.
Exactly. But our sources just completely shatter that myth. For you, the curious learner, our mission today is to move past that summary and uncover the decades of activism that came before and after that single act.
So we're looking at her as a lifelong, politically sophisticated, and the sources say a truly radical figure.
A radical figure in the civil rights movement, absolutely.
That distinction feels crucial. When we look at the source material, the portrait that emerges is not of a passive heroine at all, but a formidable organizer. We're going to explore how she was deeply involved in everything from these brutal, decade-long voter registration struggles to investigating sexual violence against Black women.
And later, her direct engagement with the Black Power movement and even anti-apartheid campaigns.
This really isn't just about what happened on the bus. It's about understanding who this woman truly was.
To really appreciate the defiance she showed on that bus, you have to understand the ground she stood on, where she came from.
Let's start there, her early life.
She was born Rosa Louise McCauley on February 4th, 1913, in Tuskegee, Alabama. And even her name, it carries this historical weight.
How so?
It was a portmanteau. It drew from the names of her grandmothers, Rose and Louisa. So right from birth, she's carrying her family's history in her name.
And that family history, it places her right at the nexus of the long struggle in the South. The sources are careful to highlight her diverse American heritage.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. You have her African ancestry, of course, but also a Scotch-Irish great-grandfather and partial Native American ancestry from a great-grandmother.
Her maternal grandfather, Sylvester Edwards, he was the child of an enslaved woman and a plantation owner's son.
So this wasn't a family that was new to the system of American racial hierarchy. This was a history written in centuries of both survival and resistance.
That is the foundation.
It is. And the landscape of her youth, it was one of constant oppressive terror. Alabama formally codified Jim Crow into law in 1901.
And that system was, it was totalizing. We tend to focus on buses and schools, but Jim Crow segregated nearly every imaginable aspect of life.
Everything. Financial institutions, hospitals, housing, courtrooms.
Even cemeteries.
Right. The whole point was to enforce not just separation, but subservience.
And what's terrifying is that this legal structure was backed up by just raw systemic violence.
The sources are very clear on this. The Ku Klux Klan was intensely active, including in her community of Pine Level.
Parks herself recalled that terror. She said she, and I'm quoting here, heard of a lot of Black people being found dead under circumstances that were just dismissed by the authorities.
So growing up, this was the air she breathed. This continuous threat of violence, if you even slightly breach the rules of the racial hierarchy.
Her early working life then puts her in direct confrontation with this.
Absolutely. She worked on the family farm, but then took on work as a domestic servant in white households. And the sources are explicit about the vulnerability of Black women in those positions.
Yeah, they were often targets of sexual harassment and, frankly, violence from their white male employers.
But she wrote about her own experiences pushing back against that. She recalled an incident with a white man she just called Mr. Charlie.
And the power of her account is in her verbal resistance. She denounced his racism. She firmly resisted his advances.
Even in those incredibly unequal spaces, she was asserting her personhood. It's really incredible.
And education was another battlefield. She attended the Montgomery Industrial School for Girls and eventually completed her high school education.
With a lot of encouragement from Raymond Parks, who would become her husband.
Yeah.
And this is not a minor detail. You have to understand. When she finished school, only about 7% of Black people in Alabama had a high school diploma.
Wow. Only 7%.
So that achievement, it speaks volumes about her dedication to self-improvement and the value they placed on knowledge.
That diploma gave her the intellectual tools and the confidence that would, define her later organizing work.
And that work starts almost immediately. When Rosa married Raymond Parks in 1932, her life just became rooted in direct activism.
Raymond was a barber and a member of the NAACP.
Right. And Parks described him as the first real activist she had ever met. She really admired his fierce opposition to racial prejudice.
And their activism wasn't slow or incremental. They jumped straight into one of the most volatile and famous legal battles of that whole era.
The Scottsboro Boys case. 9 black teenagers falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a train.
They weren't just following the case in the papers, they were essential ground troops.
They organized and hosted fundraising and legal defense meetings for the Scottsboro defense team right in their own home.
The sources also confirmed they attended meetings of the Communist Party USA.
Which is a critical detail. In the absence of broad support from, say, mainstream liberal organizations, the Communist Party was instrumental in bringing global attention and legal resources to the Scottsboro case.
So this association confirms that Parks was politically engaged with these really radical structural critiques of American capitalism and racial injustice.
Decades before 1955.
Decades before.
It's vital we connect her political theory to her lived experience. A few years later, in 1941, she gets this crucial job at Maxwell Air Force Base.
And as an Army base, Maxwell was, well, surprisingly, it was a fully integrated facility.
That experience was transformative for her. The source material notes she could take a military bus on base, sit anywhere she wanted, work alongside white colleagues as equals.
It was like a parallel universe.
It was. She said her time at Maxwell opened her eyes up. It provided an alternative reality to the ugly racial policies of Jim Crow.
So she saw with her own eyes that integration was possible, that segregation was just a political choice, not some kind of natural law.
Precisely. So when she went home in 1943 and officially joined the NAACP, becoming the secretary of the Montgomery chapter,
her commitment was now informed by a vision of freedom she had already seen firsthand.
That's exactly right. She accepted the secretarial position, which is often seen as a traditional woman's role in the movement.
But she immediately took on far heavier and more dangerous duties.
Especially the fight for the right to vote. She and Raymond were also key members of the Voters League.
And the obstacles they faced. They were designed to crush your spirit. Black citizens in Alabama had to navigate poll taxes, literacy tests designed to fail them.
They faced intrusive questions, sometimes deeply personal, sometimes ridiculously complex. And there was always the threat of employer retaliation if you even tried to register.
The statistic is just stunning. In 1940, less than 0.1% of Black Montgomeryans were actually registered to vote.
Less than 1/10%.
Unbelievable.
And Parks herself, she had to try 3 separate times before she finally succeeded in registering between 1943 and 1945.
Think about the sustained determination that requires. To face that bureaucratic hostility and the threat of violence year after year.
This was not a quick win. It was grinding systemic warfare.
Which leads us to what many historians consider the true crucible of her foundational activism.
Her deep involvement in investigating and organizing campaigns against racial and sexual violence.
This work was so dangerous, and it established the organizational network that would fuel the boycott a decade later.
The most potent example of this, and one that really deserves far more attention, is the 1944 case of Racy Taylor.
Racy Taylor, a black woman in Abbeville, was gang raped by 6 white men while she was walking home from church.
And when the grand jury failed to indict the perpetrators, Parks took on the investigation herself.
It's difficult to overstate the physical and political risk she took in that climate.
To openly investigate white men for the sexual assault of a black woman in 1944 Alabama, that was a direct challenge to the fundamental power structure of Jim Crow.
Which presumed white men's absolute dominance.
She didn't just investigate, though. She organized. Parks and other activists created the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Racy Taylor.
And this campaign, it galvanized national attention. The Chicago Defender called it the strongest campaign for equal justice to be seen in a decade.
Now, the state never secured indictments, but the movement forced the governor to promise an investigation.
So this effort, which was led by women, it provided these crucial lessons in community organizing, in fundraising, in applying national pressure.
The historian Danielle McGuire makes a very strong case that this Taylor movement brought the building blocks of the Montgomery bus boycott together a decade earlier and kept them in place.
So it confirms that the infrastructure for mass protest was female-driven and rooted in fighting sexual violence.
And Parks was involved in other difficult legal cases, too. She organized defense efforts for Jeremiah Reeves, who was accused of raping a white woman in 1952.
He was ultimately executed in 1957.
Her willingness to confront these life-and-death legal struggles reveals a woman who was already a veteran of the war against Jim Crow, years before she ever sat down on that bus.
And this long, continuous path of radicalization, it sort of culminates in the summer of 1955.
Right. She was sponsored by her friends, Clifford and Virginia Durr, to attend the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. This was an activist training center specifically dedicated to integrating people and ideas.
Highlander was pivotal. It provided a psychological break from the sheer exhaustion of Jim Crow.
She was mentored there by Septima Clark, the movement's educational director, and she described her time there where she lived and ate and worked with black and white people as absolute equals.
As the first time in her adult life, she felt entirely free of racial hostility.
She could finally envision fully what a unified society actually looked like.
What's so fascinating is the timing. She leaves Highlander, and just a few months later, the nation is rocked by the lynching of Emmett Till in August of 1955.
This event brought the brutal reality of Jim Crow violence onto the national stage in a way that was just unprecedented.
And she attended a meeting specifically about the Till case. She observed that she was heartened by the attention that people managed to get to the case, noting that usually these horrors were just covered up.
The sources show that the massive public outcry over Till signaled to organizers like Parks that maybe, just maybe, the national mood was finally shifting,
Making a localized act of defiance viable on a much larger national scale.
It seems like the seeds of the boycott were planted long before 1955. So let's turn to the specific system she challenged: segregation on Montgomery buses.
The rules of the buses, they weren't just inconvenient, they were designed to be humiliating.
Segregation on Montgomery streetcars had existed since 1900. It even led to a small, unsuccessful boycott back then. The resulting ordinance was weak. It said no black passenger had to give up a seat unless another was available.
But drivers routinely ignored this.
They absolutely did. And black people made up the economic engine of that bus system, 3/4 of all riders.
Yet the front 4 rows were permanently reserved for whites, the back section for blacks, and that middle section, that was the territory of the driver, entirely his discretion.
And that discretion was enforced with near absolute power. The drivers were armed. They held what the sources describe as policeman-like authority.
They often forced black passengers to surrender seats, even if it meant standing over empty seats in the back.
And the most degrading custom of all, it required black riders to pay their fare at the front, then get off the bus and reboard through the back door.
Which often resulted in drivers just speeding away before the passenger could get back on, leaving them stranded after they'd already paid.
Parks had a specific personal history with this cruelty, particularly with one driver, James F. Blake.
Yes, in 1943, 12 years earlier, Blake had forced her off his bus when she refused to reboard through the back after paying. She confronted him, was forced to walk home.
And after that, she made a concerted effort to avoid his buses. So this was not just some chance encounter on December 1st, 1955. For her, this was a personal score waiting to be settled.
So let's go to that day, December 1st, 1955.
Parks left her job as a seamstress at Montgomery Fair, stopped quickly, and boarded the bus at Court Square around 5:30 p.m. She was 42 years old.
And she later insisted she hadn't noticed that James F. Blake was the driver until she was already seated.
She sat in the first row of the middle section next to 3 other black riders. She noted she was in considerable physical pain that day from chronic bursitis.
The bus continued, the white-only seats filled up, and at the Empire Theater stop, a white man boarded and was forced to stand.
At that point, Blake walked back, looked at the 4 black passengers, and demanded they yield their seats so the white man could sit.
The 3 others complied and moved, but Parks just remained seated, looked straight ahead.
When Blake asked her if she was going to move, she replied with just immense poise, "You may do that."
And she later reflected on that moment. This is the quote that radically transforms the whole narrative. It moves it from physical exhaustion to pure political conviction.
People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true.
I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in.
It was an act of political saturation. She had just had enough. Blake called his supervisor, who told him to call the police.
And Parks was arrested for violating the Montgomery Municipal Code. E.D. Nixon, the leader of the NAACP, and the Durs immediately arrived to post her bail.
Now, this timing and the specific person chosen for this defiance, that's what made this act the catalyst.
We have to remember, she was far from the first person arrested for this. The sources confirm several black Montgomeryans had been arrested for the same thing,
including Claudette Colvin, who was arrested 9 months earlier at just 15 years old.
So the question remains, why Parks?
It was a strategic decision. It really reflects the politics of respectability in the mid-1950s. Organizers like Nixon and the Durs, they specifically vetted potential plaintiffs.
And they chose Parks because of her unimpeachable reputation, her high standing in the Black community, her respectful manner, her church work, and what they called her firm, quiet spirit.
They knew she could endure a long legal battle without cracking.
And the decision to sideline Claudette Colvin, it really reveals the gender and class biases at play.
It does. Colvin was only 15. She was described as feisty and uncontrollable, and she later became pregnant out of wedlock, which leaders feared would complicate the message.
They thought it would make her vulnerable to smear campaigns by segregationists.
Exactly. The movement needed a heroine that the entire nation, including moderate whites, could sympathize with. They needed Rosa Parks.
And the reaction was immediate and highly organized, primarily by women.
Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council, the WPC, they already had a boycott strategy ready to go.
They immediately organized a one-day boycott for December 5th, the day of Parks's trial. Robinson and 2 students worked late into the night at Alabama State College,
Mimeographing an astonishing 35,000 leaflets to distribute throughout the Black community.
The one-day boycott was a massive success. Ridership was incredibly low. Parks was quickly found guilty and fined $14.
And that evening, organizers formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA.
And they chose Martin Luther King Jr., then a relatively unknown 26-year-old minister, as their leader to extend the protest indefinitely.
At the Holt Street Baptist Church meeting that night, Ralph Abernathy read the initial demands to a crowd of 15,000 people.
And these demands are critical because they show the initial objective was reform, not immediate full integration.
Right. They were seeking 1, courteous treatment from drivers, 2, a first-come, first-served seating arrangement. So Black people fill seats in the back, whites from the front, meeting in the middle, no forced removal.
And 3, the hiring of Black drivers for Black bus routes.
They were demanding dignity and accountability within a still segregated framework.
Yeah.
It was a very strategic, measured approach.
The crowd was ecstatic. They voted overwhelmingly to extend the boycott. But here, the sources highlight a deeply frustrating dynamic for Parks.
Yes. Despite King hailing her as a heroine, she was discouraged from speaking that evening. She asked if she should address the massive crowd.
But someone told her she had said enough.
That moment is so illuminating. It speaks to the internal power dynamics of the movement.
She was the face, the symbol, the catalyst. But the strategic decision-making remained overwhelmingly male-dominated.
Biographers suggest this gendered exclusion contributed directly to the movement, crafting that passive public image of her, the quiet symbol that later academic critiques would call a caricature.
Regardless of her being marginalized internally, the boycott lasted 381 days.
The MIA's success depended entirely on sustaining this complex, parallel transportation network. They developed a massive, organized carpooling and ride-sharing system.
And Parks played an active, practical role in that. She served for a time as a dispatcher, organizing rides and routes for thousands of people every day.
But the retaliation was intense and brutal. Both Parks and Raymond faced continuous harassment, severe death threats, and total financial ruin.
Parks was fired from her job at Montgomery Fair in January 1956. A week later, Raymond was fired from Maxwell Air Force Base.
They gave up their economic security entirely for the cost.
The boycott finally ended when the federal lawsuit, Browder v. Gale, reached the Supreme Court. The court upheld the ruling that mandated segregation on city buses was unconstitutional.
King called off the boycott on December 20, 1956. And crucially, Parks was not a plaintiff in that case. The successful plaintiffs were Aurelia Browder, Claudette Colvin, Mary Louise Smith, and Susie McDonald.
So she was the symbol that launched the legal fight. But her name was removed from the federal suit to avoid a legal challenge. A necessary legal maneuver, maybe, but one that further complicated her official role in the victory she started.
And this is where the popular history typically closes the book on Rosa Parks, the victory in 1956.
But for Parks, the struggle became much more personal and much more difficult in the aftermath.
Despite the national success, she faced profound financial hardship and significant health problems, chronic insomnia, stomach ulcers, a heart condition, all of it stress-induced.
It's a tragic irony. The woman credited with sparking one of the great moral victories of the 20th century was left financially devastated.
She was marginalized from the mainstream MIA fundraising efforts, and she faced persistent threats. The sources confirm that tensions within the MIA leadership, specifically between King and Nixon, made her position just untenable.
So faced with this toxic mix of economic insecurity, physical exhaustion, and safety concerns, she and Raymond and her mother relocated to Detroit in 1957.
But moving north was not an automatic escape from poverty. They struggled immensely, living with family, grappling with instability.
The detail about her living situation in Detroit really underscores her neglect. In 1959, they actually lost their apartment briefly.
Yeah, and they were forced to move into a meeting hall managed by the Progressive Civic League. The black press in the early 60s started drawing attention to her situation, pointing out the scandalous fact that the mother of the civil rights movement was struggling just to pay her rent.
She never stopped working, but her struggle highlights the systemic failure of the movement to financially support its foot soldiers after the cameras went away.
The respectability that made her the perfect symbol does not translate into material security.
This financial and political struggle leads directly into her next phase of activism. In 1964, she worked tirelessly for the congressional campaign of John Conyers in Detroit.
And she successfully persuaded Martin Luther King Jr. to appear with Conyers, which was a huge boost for the candidate's profile.
Once Conyers was elected, he hired Parks in 1965 as a secretary and receptionist in his Detroit office. She held that position for over 2 decades until 1988.
This was a critical shift. Her work moved away from direct public protest and into legislative support and direct community service.
And I think we sometimes forget the importance of that everyday congressional work. Her role was essential. She was engaging directly with constituents on issues that mattered locally.
Welfare, job discrimination, affordable housing. She was the direct link visiting schools, community centers.
She made sure Conyers remained fully connected to the grassroots concerns of his district.
And it is during this Detroit period, from the late 60s onward, that the popular narrative of the quiet seamstress just completely collapses.
Her political philosophy was far more radical than her public image ever suggested.
She attended the Philadelphia Black Power Conference in 1968. She actively supported the movement throughout the 1970s.
How did a woman who became the symbol of nonviolent dignity reconcile that with her private admiration for movements that advocated a more militant structural approach?
She was unequivocal in her rejection of incrementalism. In a 1967 interview, she stated it plainly. She did not believe in gradualism.
Wow.
And following the devastating 1967 Detroit riot, she took the shocking step of supporting the rioters. She compared the burning and looting, which she acknowledged was destructive, to her own actions during the boycott.
She's equating structural defiance with physical destruction born of desperation.
For her, the riot was a legitimate, albeit violent, response to deep-seated economic oppression.
That changes everything about how we should view her political allegiances. And her radicalism wasn't just theoretical.
Not at all. She openly admired the Nation of Islam spokesman Malcolm X. She befriended Robert F. Williams, an advocate of armed self-defense, after he returned to the U.S. from Cuba and China.
And maybe the most compelling detail that shatters her sanitized image: she visited the Black Panther School in Oakland.
During the 1979-1980 academic year, she loved the visit. She praised the Panthers for their commitment to community education and empowerment.
The school's director, Erica Huggins, later called her a radical woman, a revolutionary woman, for showing up at an elementary school run by the Black Panther Party.
This tells us the people who knew Rosa Parks understood her as a lifelong revolutionary, not just a spontaneous dissenter.
The 1970s also saw her dedicate considerable energy to advocating for political prisoners, a classic radical concern.
This work moved her focus from legal rights to legal injustice, focusing on those she felt were victimized by the carceral system.
She played a key role in the Detroit Defense Committee for Joanne Little.
Joanne Little was a black woman charged with killing her white jailer while resisting sexual assault in 1974. Her acquittal in 1975 was a landmark case that drew on the same themes of racial and sexual violence. Parks had been fighting since the Russie Taylor chase 3 decades earlier.
She was also a vocal supporter of Angela Davis.
Yes, introducing her to a crowd of 12,000 as a dear sister who has endured significant persecution. And she organized on behalf of Gary Tyler, a black man wrongfully convicted who spent 41 years in prison.
Her commitment was to those who had paid the highest price for resistance.
Even amidst immense personal loss, her husband Raymond died of cancer in 1977, her brother Sylvester soon after, she continued her broader fight. She supported Jesse Jackson's presidential campaigns, was heavily involved in the Free South Africa movement,
participating in anti-apartheid demonstrations.
And this commitment to the future led her to co-found the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development in 1987. It focused on developing youth leadership, offering pathways to freedom, bus tours to historical sites. She was actively teaching the next generation.
Her life ended much as it began, marked by both struggle and incredible grace. In 1994, at age 81, she suffered a traumatic event. She was robbed and attacked in her Detroit home.
By a man named Joseph Skipper. He punched her in the face before stealing a small amount of cash.
Her reaction to being victimized is one of the most remarkable stories of her later life.
Many saw this attack as a sign of deep moral decay. A young black man attacking a revered black elder.
But Parks expressed profound compassion for him. She cautioned against reading too much into the attack and insisted that people should look at the conditions that made him this way.
It showed a lifelong commitment to systemic analysis, even in the face of her own trauma. It's just stunning.
After the attack, she moved. And the sources reveal a fascinating detail about her private support. Mike Ilitch, the owner of Little Caesars Pizza,
heard about her struggles and offered to pay for her housing expenses indefinitely. He deposited funds into a trust to ensure her stability.
It's an unusual intersection of celebrity, wealth, and quiet charity that stabilized her later life.
Despite this, her financial affairs continued to be complicated. In 2002, she received an eviction notice from her apartment for non-payment of rent,
which caused a public outcry. Her church and legal team intervened, the issue was resolved, and she was allowed to live there rent-free until her death.
But the episode painfully underscored the vulnerability of even our most celebrated American heroes.
Rosa Parks died of natural causes on October 24, 2005, at the age of 92, and the public response was unprecedented.
She was accorded honors previously reserved for presidents and military commanders. She was only the 31st individual and just the second private citizen to lie in honor in the United States Capitol Rotunda.
Over 40,000 mourners paid their respects. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice attended, and she said that without Parks, she probably would not be standing here today.
Her memorialization is just monumental. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1996, the Congressional Gold Medal in 1999.
An award that passed the Senate unanimously, though there was some opposition in the House from Representative Ron Paul.
And across the country, she's etched into the landscape. Detroit's 12th Street was renamed Rosa Parks Boulevard. The actual bus she was riding is a centerpiece at the Henry Ford Museum.
The Rosa Parks Library and Museum opened in Montgomery in 2000.
And her national symbolism continued to grow after her death. She was the first Black American to have a statue placed in the National Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol. President Obama attended the unveiling in 2013.
More recently, in 2021, a bust of Parks was added to the Oval Office. Her name has literally been placed among the stars. The asteroid 284996 Rosa Parks was named in her memory.
But despite all these honors, a profound conflict exists in the historical record. A battle over how Rosa Parks is remembered.
Right. The official simplified narrative, the one in textbooks, is the quiet heroine.
This traditional story emphasizes a singular moment of dignified weariness. Senator Bill Frist, for instance, claimed her act was not an intentional attempt to change a nation.
Just a unique act of human dignity, this focus on quiet strength and feminine dignity.
And this is precisely where the strong academic counterargument comes in. Historians like Jean Theo Harris contend that this popular narrative is a gendered caricature.
One that is intentionally or unintentionally designed to obscure the decades of radical activism and political philosophy that defined her life.
I think we need to slow down on this point. How exactly does simplifying her story into the quiet seamstress narrative serve, say, conservative interests?
The academic Dennis Carlson argues that this simplification transforms her into a monumentalist hero.
And what does that mean exactly?
By framing her defiance as isolated, spontaneous, and legally focused, it minimizes the violent, collective, and structural struggle that actually defined the movement.
So the monumentalist hero narrative suggests that great change just happens through individual, quiet dignity.
Instead of through sustained, painful, decades-long collective action, which often included the radical elements she supported, like the Black Power movement.
So if we accept the simple story, it makes the struggle seem easier, more polite, and less challenging to the established order.
It's a way of celebrating the outcome while sanitizing the revolutionary process.
Exactly. And the biographer Daryl Mace also highlights that her passive public image was shaped not just by external forces, but by internal dynamics within the movement itself.
The male-dominated leadership of the MIA, the gendered norms of the 1950s, they actively relegated her to the role of a symbol.
Limiting her participation in crucial strategic discussions, like being told she had said enough at that first big meeting.
And this focus on the perfect symbol leads directly back to those who were deliberately excluded.
Right. Parks became the celebrated face, but the sources confirm many others played crucial legal roles. And Claudette Colvin, the 15-year-old arrested 9 months prior, was deemed unsuitable.
Colvin was described as feisty and uncontrollable, and her later pregnancy sealed her exclusion.
It raises a crucial question that sociologists have long studied. Why does history choose specific heroes? Why are certain narratives elevated while others, messier, younger, or less conventionally respectable, are systematically forgotten?
The simplified account focusing solely on Parks was strategically convenient, but it sacrificed historical accuracy.
And her symbolic power was so immense that she even had to legally fight to control how her name was used in culture. The most famous example is the 1999 lawsuit she filed against the hip-hop duo Outkast.
Over their song, Rosa Parks, she claimed unauthorized use of her name and potential harm to her reputation.
The legal battle was prolonged and complex. She filed a $5 billion lawsuit, arguing the song was an attempt to profit off her name without permission.
The case was ultimately settled in 2005, and the outcome is quite instructive.
It mandated that Outkast and their company, BMG, pursue projects aimed at educating youth about the significant role Rosa Parks played in making America a better place for all races.
It forced a reconciliation between the commercial use of her image and her enduring educational mission.
But not all cultural interpretations were viewed positively by her allies. The 2002 film Barbershop sparked significant controversy.
Right, because a character suggested her fame was largely due to her NAACP connections and timing, rather than just her action alone.
That led to sharp criticism from activists like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. Parks herself actually boycotted the NAACP Image Awards that year because the actor involved was hosting.
It shows that even a fictional conversation about the mechanics of her fame could provoke serious real-world consequences.
But the shift toward the more complex, radical portrait is gaining traction in modern media. The 2018 Doctor Who episode Rosa was widely praised for its sensitive handling of the event.
And more recently, the 2022 documentary The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, inspired directly by the academic critiques, attempts to finally cement this image of the lifelong revolutionary.
So what does this all mean for our understanding of Rosa Parks? The deeper we dive into her sources, the clearer it becomes that her legacy is a story of continuous, radical commitment, forged in the heat of decades of struggle.
She was a politically sophisticated organizer long before 1955, involved in crucial fights like voter registration and seeking justice for victims of sexual violence.
And she carried that revolutionary spirit forward, even when it led her to support figures like Malcolm X and groups like the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers, challenging the gradualism favored by the mainstream.
Her refusal wasn't an isolated, spontaneous event. It was the perfectly timed culmination of years of community organizing and personal struggle. She was strategically selected by the WPC and the NAACP precisely because of her unimpeachable personal character.
Yet she paid a heavy, enduring price for that courage, facing poverty, serious health issues, and deep personal loss long after the celebratory headlines had faded away.
She gave us the blueprint for what profound, sustained resistance looks like. She demonstrated that revolutionary change requires not just singular moments of dramatic defiance, but decades of difficult, dedicated, and often thankless work behind the scenes.
We hope this deep dive encourages you to look closely at the simplified historical narratives you encounter and demand a more complex, honest story.
And a final thought for you to mull over. If the civil rights movement had chosen the 15-year-old Claudette Colvin as the primary test case in March 1955, given her personality and her subsequent out-of-wedlock pregnancy, would the Montgomery bus boycott have succeeded with the same impact and maintained the necessary unity for 381 days?
Or did the prevailing gender and respectability norms of the 1950s make the selection of a figure with Parks' specific, dignified, high standing an absolute necessity for that scale of success?
Think about how those societal biases shape not just whose stories get told, but which struggles are allowed to succeed.